And so here's the first algorithm that you might actually want to look at. Nearest neighbors. Who's heard of a nearest neighbor algorithm before? Nice. Most of you have. It's also because this is the simplest algorithm that you can almost think of in terms of machine learning. But it's actually also one that you should pretty much use as a baseline, as a reference to compare your implementation against. And you will be surprised how hard it is sometimes to beat nearest neighbors. Okay. So for those who haven't heard of nearest neighbors yet, the algorithm is just exactly like what's in the name. You basically go and pick the instance in your data set that is most similar to your query, and then you attach it the label that you found for that item in the data set. So if you think about it, right, we have some blue squares and red triangles, and then we want to find out, what's the label of this red guy, of this, green circle here. And so what you do is you look at its nearest neighbors, and okay, let's do a little bit of counting. So the nearest neighbor is red. Okay, so if I just use the nearest neighbor, then I'll say it's red. If I was to look out further, then it would really depend on how far out I look. So why is this a really easy algorithm to implement on small amounts of data? Any suggestions? Yep?
Because all you need to do is the dot product between your features for each data point, and for small amounts of data, that's a very quick operation for each one.
Yes. So so to just repeat the answer. So what the argument was, if I have a Euclidean distance, right? So let's just do that. We have basically that d of x and x prime is just the norm of x minus x prime. And let's just square it for good measure because it doesn't really change anything. In which case, I can write this as norm of x squared plus norm of x prime squared minus 2x x prime. Okay, sorry, my handwriting is horrible. But the key point is exactly this part here where I just have an inner product. Because these two terms, they are not dependent on the interaction between x and x prime. So if I, for instance, already have x as my query and I just want to find x prime, then, well, I don't really need x in order to find the nearest neighbor, the norm of x squared. All I need to do is I need to look at x prime squared minus 2x dot x prime. And the latter is a simple inner product. Now, if I have fancier distances than this, then maybe I want to use another efficient implementation. So, for instance, you could look for a Hamming distance, right? So you could check whether all the bits agree. So depending on which similarity measure I use, this can be done very efficiently. Quick question. Does somebody know how to compute this last bit here efficiently? This inner product. Does somebody know how to compute it efficiently? So if you were to implement that on your computer, what would you do? Okay. I mean, the first thing you could do is you use MATLAB, probably, right? Because MATLAB's really easy. And that's actually not a bad idea here, because MATLAB actually has an optimized version of x.x prime implemented. Okay? So using the GPU, well, okay, this is heavy duty, right? So basically the point is, let's use a faster processor. Okay. So on the GPU, what will you do? You're probably going to use some CUDA routines, or rather cuBLAS. So let me write that out. Now, cuBLAS is CUDA basic linear algebra subroutines. The key point here is BLAS, basically in the algebra subroutines, which exists, well, both for a GPU and also exists for your desktop computer. Okay. But let's stay with the GPU example. So what goes wrong with nearest neighbors if I do it on a GPU? Okay.
Single point precision, I think, is all we tend to have.
So you might end up with that problem, but that's actually not going to be the main issue. There's a much, much bigger issue. Any suggestions? So if I get something like a GeForce 970 right now, it has 4 gigabytes of memory. Now, if my instances, my prototypes don't fit into 4 gigabytes, I'm hosed, right? Because then I run out of memory and I can't actually perform this inner product efficiently anymore. On top of that, it'll actually impose a fairly heavy memory bandwidth requirement. But okay, it's a GPU and they have fairly high memory bandwidth. So it's mostly running out of memory where you will run into trouble. If you have a desktop computer, well, you know, maybe it'll take 4 times as long before you run into that problem, but it'll still happen. So nearest neighbor algorithms are hideously memory inefficient. And furthermore, they also mean that you actually have to go through all the instances. Now, there are fast alternatives to that. There are very interesting data structures that can be used. But basically, this is one of the reasons why they are not as popular as you would think otherwise. But let's look at an example. So here's the one nearest neighbor. And this is actually, I took 2 Gaussians, drew points from it, and looked at the regions of redness and blueness according to the one nearest neighbor. Okay. Let's see what happens if I take 4 nearest neighbors. And what I did here is I stratified according to the number of nearest neighbors of red or of blue. And what you can see is that, well, you get a slightly richer representation of exactly what the boundary is. And this is the actual boundary if I just look at, you know, where I have more reds or more blues. By the way, you should probably use an odd number such that you can break ties, or you don't have to break ties. But I just picked 4 to make it nice and symmetric. Okay. Now, there's a couple of really nice things that you can do with that. So first of all, if I get, you know, more data, if the problem is, you know, perfectly separable, I'll get a clear separation, and on noisy problems, I will not do too badly. Well, I will not do amazingly well, but I won't do too badly with one nearest neighbor. However, if I actually let my neighborhood increase slightly as we get more data, then I will get something that will actually converge to the optimal solution. The rationale for getting better performance if I include more nearest neighbors is because, well, I could always get unlucky and have a single stray instance of the wrong category, but it's very unlikely that I will get unlucky many, many times. Right? So if we go back here, basically, sorry. If we look at this region here, right, there it's really murky to decide, you know, whether in class blue or in class red. But as I get more data, of course, these majorities will become more obvious. And so therefore, by just using a large enough neighborhood, I will, first of all, you know, get more statistical confidence. But also, since I'm getting way more data than how I'm increasing my neighborhoods themselves will shrink. And that's basically why using k nearest neighbors with k mildly increasing with sample size will do well. Yes?
So I think that's the point. I mean, is using more number of nearest neighbor increasing the performance efficiency or the memory efficiency of it?
So the memory efficiency will not improve with either of those. Nearest neighbors, in its plain vanilla form, can be quite slow. And you may actually end up having fun with nearest neighbors in a practical assignment. Now, However, what happens is that if I don't only ask my nearest neighbor, but look, let's say, at my 5 nearest neighbors or 10 nearest neighbors, I will get more statistical confidence. Because it's very unlikely that my 10 nearest neighbors in the majority will be of the wrong class. Whereas for 1, this can happen much more easily. But of course, I should make sure that I'm converging to the locally correct solution rather than just the global majority vote. And this is why I need to make sure that the range that I'm looking at with my k nearest neighbors actually ends up shrinking as I get more data. So you basically have those 2 curves. So if you think about it, so let's just plot sample size m versus range. And the range should actually go down. And at the same time, you want to make sure that k, and here's m, that number actually increases. Because this gives you confidence, this part here, and this gives you locality. Right? So that's basically why you have this interesting trade-off. You can make this formal, and there's a lot of nice papers about consistency of nearest neighbors classifiers that look at this. But that's essentially the trade-off that you're playing with. Yes?
What is range?
So the range is basically, if I look at my k nearest neighbors, right? So I'm the query, I'm looking at my k nearest neighbors. If I pick k equals 1, then I'm probably going to pick you, because you're my nearest neighbor. If I'm going to pick k equals 10, well, then it'll be probably the guys around here. If I pick k equals 100, I'll end up with a range between here and, pretty much the wall, right? So that's what I mean with range, with distance, right? So therefore, I want to make sure that the ball enclosing all my nearest neighbors shrinks as I get more data, such that I get a really fine-grained resolution. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I keep on getting more and more people or data points within that range to get more accuracy. You'll get to play with that actually in your experiments. Okay, thanks for the question. Any other? Yes?
In the previous slide, what was the color coding for?
This was for how many so the question was, what was the color coding? Well, this basically means all 4 are reds. This is 3 out of 4s are reds, 2 out of 4 tie. Okay, and here's 4 blues. Right. That's basically what the color coding is good for. And what you can see is actually those regions are called Voronoi cells. They're basically cells where a certain point is the nearest, or then a certain set of points is the nearest relative to everything else. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there a way to figure out what is the best metric that you can have norm for the norm?
Cool question. So the question is there a way to figure out what the best metric is? Okay. So first of all, I have to disappoint you. Well, no. However, there are ways on learning what a good metric is. Because probably a Euclidean distance without any scaling is not particularly meaningful, right? So there are various algorithms where you can actually go and say, well, I want to minimize the error that I'm incurring from my nearest neighbors by essentially manipulating the distances. So for instance, one thing that you could do is you could require that the points of the correct class will be closer to you than the points of the wrong class. And then you basically end up with a metric learning problem. So that's a very nice paper by Ng, Jordan, and Singh from about 10 years ago, which does exactly that. So if you repost that question on Piazza, I can post a link for that. Yes?
Why are they more than 5 regions?
Sorry? Can you repeat it?
Why are there more than 5 others?
Why are there more than 5 regions? Well, we go from 4 to 3 to 1 to 0, well, basically a tie, to 1 to 3 to 3, 4, right? So that makes 9 regions. by my math. Because I'm going from all reds to all blues.
But if it's not red, it is already blue. So if the four nearest are, if we only have the three, if only three of the nearest are red, then
Yeah.
one of the nearest is blue.
Correct.
So then you go from 4-0 to
True.
3-1
Yes.
to 2-2.
I apologize. Yes, you're right. Okay, maybe I picked more than 4 nearest neighbors. That may very well be the case here. Sorry about that. Those slides are a little bit older, and maybe I ran the MATLAB script with more than 4. Thanks, good catch. So we can probably work out from this how many shades of blue there are, and then, okay, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so we have 8 nearest neighbors here. And then we're done. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I have 8 different colors, so. Okay. Okay, good. Any other questions? Yes?
Is it practical to learn the metric?
It depends. There are cases when it's actually quite effective. So especially if you have, so for instance, one of the things is you have to be in a situation where nearest neighbors is really the algorithm you badly want to use. And there are lots of other algorithms that may actually be better than nearest neighbors. But if for some reason you have a very fast nearest neighbor lookup structure, for instance, web search does that, right? So you actually are going to perform some form of a nearest neighbor lookup for your query. I mean, by now it uses a lot of other cool things, but then it actually makes a lot of sense to, for instance, weigh the relative importance of words. So that's a metric learning, right? I mean, I'm oversimplifying things grossly here, but in web search, you have a situation that's not totally unrelated. It also makes sense whenever you get really good performance out of this, which is kind of not really answering the question, but essentially, you want to make sure that after going through all the pain of learning the metric, you actually get an algorithm that is competitive with something that you could have just used off the shelf. Because otherwise, I mean, why would you do that? Thirdly, sometimes you care more about the metric than about the nearest neighbor algorithm itself. So maybe you want to use this to find a good measure of similarity between images in general. So for instance, I could start with giving you, an annotated image data set, and you want to make sure that similar images group together, and you want to use that then to perform general nearest neighbor queries for images to find related images, right? So you could basically use a classification problem to get some features to then do decent query by example for images. And things like that are actually, well, basically people look at them, right? Yeah, but nearest neighbors is usually a really good baseline because it's one of those really simple dumb algorithms that is not that easy to beat. And it's inherently nonlinear, so you can, efficiently deal with it. Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there a way to structure the data so that you don't have to compare your new point with every other point?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of clever algorithms on how to have fast lookup and retrieval data structures. One of the really nice ones is called cover trees. So let me just write it out. And this is by Langford et al. I think he did that when he was a PhD student here over a decade ago. And essentially, it's a tree-based lookup structure. And the interesting twist is that there is not necessarily a unique assignment of a point to any particular node in the tree, but it's sufficiently unique that you don't have to look for a lot of alternatives. And so that trade-off makes construction of the tree reasonably cheap while keeping retrieval still logarithmic in the size of the data set. That's one example of what you can do. You can maybe use core sets and structure them hierarchically. There's also something called KD trees. And the Dean of Computer Science, Andrew Moore, did a lot of really cool research on that when he was still doing research before he went to Google. So basically, and Alex Gray, one of his PhD students, then took that up further and wrote a whole bunch of other papers in this context at Georgia Tech. So these are some of the direct structured lookup techniques. And then there are things like locality-sensitive hashing, which is something that we'll not get a chance to cover in this class, but you can look it up, LSH. And basically what it tries to do is it tries to accelerate nearest neighbor lookups by projecting into lower dimensional spaces where that lookup is much faster, and then only later on you actually have to go and drill down in more detail. And so the idea is basically you find those randomized projections in such a way that they're good enough to whittle down the sets efficiently, and then only later on when you really need perfect accuracy, you basically add more attributes. So in other words, there's still a lot of research going into this, but for a number of reasons that are not necessarily just for machine learning. By the way, thanks for asking those questions. It's good. I'm actually quite delighted. More questions? Okay, then let's move on. And so the next thing that you can do is linear regression, right? So linear regression is actually a very simple algorithm, and you've probably used it in the past. So you basically get the data, and maybe you correlate depth with gold price, and you then infer this nice linear relationship. Well, you can make out of that whatever you want, but basically, how do we get this line? You can plot it, and you can squint at it and say, well, that's the line, but that's kind of awkward. So how can we actually solve this mathematically? So what I can do is I can say, well, look, I actually have a very simple linear model. This is the model of a line. This guy here. That's my line. Right? And then what I want to do is I want to make sure that the distance between the line and the points on the line is small. So in other words, this value here. So I want to minimize this. So what I go and do is I actually plug this in here. Right? So now we have a function of two parameters, namely a and b. And I want to make sure that the average squared distance, that's one of the things that I could minimize, is small for all the points. Okay. Well, yeah, that's why it's called the average squared distance. And for convenience, I've just added the 1/2 in front, such that when I take the derivative of the square, then the 1/2 goes away. And so I can take the derivative with regard to a. And what I'll get is just the sum over I goes from 1 to m, xi a times xi plus b minus yi. And then I also get the condition on b. The condition on b is the same thing, sum over all the I, axi plus b minus yi. Yeah, there's an I missing here. Okay. So now I have two equations involving a and b. Is there anything special about those two equations? Well, the special thing is that this is basically a matrix, right? I basically have something of the form matrix times a and b equals some value z. Right. So what that means is that I can simply go and solve this for a and b by inverting with m. And if this matrix is invertible, the world is good. So rather than solving a 2x2 matrix, which I guess you've probably done before, let's have fun with a slightly more general problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the optimization problem for just standard vectors and with a constant offset. Who has seen something of this form before? Okay, not so many. Okay, so let me write out what this really means. This means it's the sum over all the j's, and here we have basically a j xj plus b. Now what I can do is I can rewrite this by adding the constant 1 to the vector x. This is a very common trick that's probably useful to know. I'm basically padding x by a constant. Right? Okay. And now all I have to do is I just have to lump a and b together into the vector w. By how much does the dimensionality of a increase? So basically, how much larger is w relative to a in terms of dimensionality? Okay. Who says it's larger by a factor of 2? Who would say it's larger by 1? Okay. Yes, all hands should go up for that. Okay. Because all I've done is I've just, let's say a is a 5-dimensional vector, and I'm just adding, one extra parameter to it. And the only reason why I'm doing this is because I don't like to deal with, 2 parameters if I can write the algebra in terms of 1. And so now I get this optimization problem here. So w dot x bar I, which is now the new x and 1, minus yi. So now I take the derivative of that. So if you squint hard at this, you can see that this is a linear function. Actually, let me see. Sorry. So basically, we have a linear function here in x, right? And so now, if I want to take the derivative of, let's say, dw of w dot x, this just gives me x. It's just like a linear function in 1 dimension. Here we have it in d dimensions. So if you've never taken differential derivatives, now is probably a good time to grab your math books and read up on that again. Because we will need that a lot for the rest of the class. So it's still very easy on the math right now. It's going to get more interesting later. Now, if I take the derivative with respect to w, well, okay, here I just have to use the chain rule. So I get w dot x bar I minus yi, same thing as here.